Welcome back, Pastor Daniel. So glad to have you today with me at Restitutio and talking about generations again. Last time we talked about the greatest generation, the silent generation, and the baby boomers. And today we're looking at the younger generations, Gen X, Millennials, what comes after that?
Z.
Z,
Yeah.
and Alpha.
Yeah. You got to
And
restart the alphabet, right? So,
yeah, it's like COVID variants.
yeah.
It started going with the Greek letters. So welcome back. So glad to have you with me today.
Glad to be here. We had a great conversation. Looking forward to talking about these younger generations, even though I'm interested in what the older people have gone through. These are my people. So,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
the ones that you feel like you have shared experience with.
Right.
Yeah, I feel that too. All right. So what is a Generation X person?
Well, the idea is here that just in the same way, and we mentioned in the last episode about how there was a baby boom, well, there was then a baby bust. And the idea being that, the silent generation had tons of babies, but then the baby boomers didn't. And there are many reasons for that. Some of it is attributed to how the divorce rate went up, and
Yeah,
and just people didn't have as many kids, or put the value, or make family the priority that they should have. And just in general, as people get more free and more prosperous, I guess, as society does and has over the past 50, 60 years, you just tend to have less kids because you don't need, especially back in the day, the mentality was we need more kids to work on the farm.
oh yeah,
That was like 100 years ago. That was the mentality. Now you can have two kids, like Sarah and my wife and I have had two kids, and we're happy. We're good. We're good with that. So certainly having more kids can be a blessing in a different way, but it just seems that more and more people had less kids. And so Generation X, partly why they were called that is there was nothing that really defined them. And and it became such where, again, because many of them were living in divorced parent situations and things like that, they had to be on their own a lot because both parents were now working. That was a major shift. The moms were now working, and they would come home from school and just be alone for hours at a time.
yeah. They called
And
us latchkey kids, where
latchkey kids, right?
yeah, we would just get home and have to let ourselves into where we live and be alone
Right.
for a while. Um, Full disclosure for myself, my mom chose to stay at home,
Mhm.
and this would be like in the '80s when I was a little guy. Um, that was already getting to be weird. That was
Mm.
already getting to be kind of looked at with like a skew glance, like
Right.
why aren't you working? And
Yeah, you could be working.
she's like, what are you talking about? I am working, And as it turns out, I'm one of five children, so yeah, it was actually a
Right,
lot of
right.
work. And
Yeah,
especially as you get into the older years where you are being driven to these different practices and different parts of your life in the minivan, and that
yeah,
certainly was my context. But yeah, a lot of my friends came from single parent homes.
yeah.
Um, Divorce was very normal
Right.
for Gen X, for the parents of Gen X kids, probably as a consequence of what we talked about last time with the boomers and that just passion for freedom and like changing things and like, I don't like this marriage, I'm going to change it.
Right.
And, that mindset. So, yeah, I definitely resonate with what you're saying here. Even though
Right.
it wasn't my personal experience, I definitely saw it a lot.
Yeah, you saw it in people in your age group for sure. And just to be clear, the age group is like the age range for this group is 1965 to 1980. That's when they were born. So if you were born in the late 60s and throughout the 70s, then you're part of this generation where, again, there was a certain degree of this generation could have gone either way. It could have been a hopeful, optimistic generation, and there are certainly a lot of things that happened in throughout the '80s and into the '90s that gave hope to a lot of people, like the Berlin Wall coming down and the fall of the USSR and just all the change that happened over there in Europe and so on. That gave a lot of hope. But then people saw, as usually is the case, a lot of became disillusioned with politicians failing us, like Bill Clinton having his affair and that sort of thing, and that's getting a little bit later into the '90s. But maybe the key being seeing their parents not being everything that they could have been, and becoming disillusioned with that. A lot of anger, a lot of cynicism became a part of Gen X, and that really started to manifest in the '90s.
Yeah, for sure. I remember being a kid watching the Challenger take off and explode on one of those. Those in my age group would remember this. They had these like huge carts that they put the boxy television on.
Yeah, I remember that.
They'd wheel it in and had the strap on it so it wouldn't fall off the cart.
Yeah.
And they'd wheel it in, and it was like a special event when somebody wheeled in a television to watch something, and it blew up, and it was just like I was young enough that like I didn't even really emotionally process it. I didn't get that there were people die. I just watched people die. Like I didn't process that at all. But I just do remember that is like part of the psyche, though. Like sometimes rockets blow up, and so like when the more recent space race between SpaceX and Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic and over against NASA, which is like not doing much with putting satellites out. When that, and Elon Musk is like, oh, we're gonna land a rocket. It's just gonna come right down. We'll use gyroscopes and we'll land it on the sea. And I'm like, I can't help but watch this stuff. And like it gets there and then it tips over. And I'm as a Gen Xer, I'm like, what do you think was gonna happen? Like, of course. Yeah. Whereas like others are like, oh, I can't believe that. But now they figured it out, and now it is actually somewhat viable. And it's just part of like the back of my psyche that like just to get really recent, Russia or Putin recently said he's putting all his nukes on the highest alert level, and a lot of people are just like, what does that even mean? They didn't even know what that means. I'm like, I know what that means. I grew up when they were always at their highest alert level. Like, I remember being a child, looking up at the sky, seeing a jet, like in the distance with the jet stream and everything behind it, and thinking to myself, that could be the one. Right. That could be the one that drops the nuke that like ends the world. And like, that was normal. We did drills where we went into the hallway and crouched and covered in case a bomb went off far enough away to not instantly kill us, but close enough away to break all the glass. And the hallway was in between the classrooms, and that was the protected space. Yeah. We never once did a lock yourself in your classroom because there's a shooter drill. Right. You know what I mean? And so it's just a different generation. And I think we too, the Gen X, we grew up in a time where there was unprecedented levels of violence in America. I learned this from the Freakonomics book, where they analyzed some of the violent crime patterns. And if you look up, I mean, I don't know about the last couple of years because there was a lot with COVID and then Black Lives Matter protests and riots and so on. But if you look at the overall chart, like it peaked in the 90s. Just violence was crazy in America. And you didn't feel safe. And you didn't have stability in the home, most of us. And the world, you looked out at the world and it's like kind of a gray place. It wasn't a place for like flowers and blue skies and hippies and free love. It was just like, I hope we make it.
There's an interesting thing that I want to note here, especially as it was reflected in pop culture. In the 80s, the idea of the good guy versus the bad guy, was prevalent. Like you would watch movies where there was a clear good guy and clear bad guy,
Yeah.
you know, and you know, the but everything that you guys as Gen X went through, it just continued to feed the cynicism within you. And again, we're speaking in broad generalities, but that then manifested in the pop culture in the 90s. And this is, you know, a ridiculous example of it, but it really, really ridiculous in the content. I was when I first went to, so I'm a millennial, and I got to be a kid in the 80s, or rather a very young kid in the 80s. So I don't remember the Challenger disaster. I didn't watch that live, or I was too young for that. And but I got in the 90s the manifestation of Gen X in the pop culture. And so I even showed this clip in church just because it was so, it illustrated this. Vince McMahon from the wrestling WWF.
Oh, I know all about Vince McMahon.
Yeah. I mean, like when I was in grade 9, I was into all that stuff, and it was the late 90s, and he went on TV and said the days of good guys versus bad guys is passe. You know, it's definitely passe, and we're not going to be doing that stuff anymore. And that really like illustrates and puts to the forefront of the gray, as you said, right there. What was right and wrong? Well, the people that you're supposed to be looking up to are doing the wrong thing. You know, like Bill Clinton and that sort of thing. So Gen X is just this, as I say in other times, an amazing hybrid of previous generations, because we can talk about all the negative side of things, but if it wasn't for Gen Xers and what they brought in terms of technology and just bringing us into the digital age and the internet age, that was a game changer. So and that's mostly because of Gen X.
Yeah. It is definitely reflected in our TV shows, The Simpsons, and MTV, and the whole genre, the whole genre of alternative rock. Yeah, that was us, and just like the whole like goth movement.
That's right.
That was all in there.
I forgot about that.
Yeah. And you had your big hair in the 80s, and these guys that were became these like hard rock, heavy metal, classic rock. That's all in the mix, and then that's in the earlier period, and then the later period is the alternative music, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Metallica. A lot of these bands that had a certain kind of vibe to them. And it was very much like a rebelliousness, very similar to Boomers, but it without the optimism. It wasn't like we're going to rebel and then we're going to remake the world into a better place. It was like, no, it's all messed up, and that's just the way it is. And I'm just going to shake my fist and express my rage, and I've got no real point at the end of the day that I'm trying to make here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, I don't know. I think you can sum it up. Nirvana was this huge band in the early 90s and brought this whole alternative rock scene into the forefront. But I don't know, take Smells Like Teen Spirit, the song itself. It's mostly, he's just making up lyrics. It doesn't mean anything. And, and that's sort of, you're not standing for anything. You're just being different because you don't want to be your parents. So it's counterculture for the sake of... And
then he killed himself.
And so that's just it. So like, if you want to, like, you had this mentality of being counterculture and all this stuff, and then you see this person that you idolize kill himself because that didn't bring him any fulfillment. And unless somebody was there to show them the way, that is to God, like what did these people in your generation have to do? They had to just they became nihilists in a sense, right?
Yeah. But nihilism doesn't satisfy you. The only real philosophical question for a nihilist is whether or not to commit suicide. Talk about a depressing belief system. I think they're and Gen X people are not dead. We're still here. Okay, just for the record.
Yeah.
So, our childhood was what it was, but I think we are, in a sense, primed to hear some good news, primed to question everything and arrive at truth from God as well, because and I've seen this with some folks that I grew up with, and their attitudes towards God and towards religion. I got made fun of a lot. Not that I was like a very good Christian, honestly, but like because my dad was a pastor, and I went. We had house church in those days. But they made fun of me and they ridiculed me, and certainly TV was constantly ridiculing anyone that believed in God.
Right.
A lot of our comedy, like rated R horror movies, or just like big blockbuster movies, would like just take shots at Christianity randomly. So there was just a general sense of like, religion is definitely not the answer, and I'm not even going to pursue that as a viable course of investigation. However, as we age, we've tried the other things. We've tried drugs, we tried sex, we tried success, we tried education, we tried social justice. We tried the charity route, and maybe working for the Peace Corps, or pouring ourselves out for the hungry people. When I was a kid, it was like hungry kids in Ethiopia, and they had these images of the distended belly, and
Right.
all this. And we've tried all these things, and now you're in your 40s or in your 50s, and you're just saying to yourself, like, I'm still looking, right?
Right.
So I believe the Gen Xers, even though you might not think of them as like the most like typical generation to evangelize, I think there's a huge opportunity for my people to come to Christ, even now in the 2020s, because they're a lot of people, they're under this illusion that if I just get an education, then I'll be happy. And then they get the education, and they're like, if I just get a job, then I'll be happy. And if I just get married, then I'll be happy. If I just have kids, then I'm happy. By the time you're in your 40s or 50s, forget about it. If you're in your early 60s, like,
Right.
None of those things actually make you happy. Even if you have a great marriage, even if you have kids that love you, even if you have a job that pays the bills and gives you even extra to have discretionary funds to do fun stuff with, it still doesn't satisfy you. You can buy the newest iPhone and still feel like you haven't really, there's still something missing. And I think that's, a real opportunity for us to reach out to Gen X and say, you know what will plug that hole? You know what will be big enough to satisfy your soul? Nothing less than God.
Right.
So I'm optimistic, but that's my nature. I'm an optimist.
Well, no,
even though I came from despair.
Right. No, and then this is, again, we're speaking in general terms. Obviously, there's going to be individuals within every generation that don't identify with the majority of their generation. But to your point of there's still people to reach in the older generations, and Gen X in particular, are probably, because especially the fact that you guys are now in your 40s into your 50s, that's like the core of leadership. People who are in leadership in church probably are in that age range. And so we want to reach out to those people. And the good thing for a pastor, for any pastor who wants their church to grow, and just to be absolutely clear, we recognize that God is the one who changes people's hearts, and that it is the gospel message that provides the platform on which God to do the work of salvation, if that's the right way to put it. But we're talking about how the gospel is packaged, and how church and this life of faith is packaged. And what the Gen Xers did in the 90s and later is take what the baby boomers did and just go further and say, hey, why can't we have a full rock band up there? If that's the kind of music we like, why can't we do that? Why can't we have lights and projector screen and all this other stuff, and it just modernized the church, brought it into the 90s, brought it into the 21st century. And that's interesting to the degree that churches like the one I'm pastoring, to the degree that we modernize our church, and it's 2022 and we're still trying to modernize. We will attract Gen Xers because Gen Xers, remember, aren't against the idea of church. Mm-hmm. They just want it to be something that they can identify with.
Yeah.
As opposed to the younger generations, which we'll get to in a second.
I would say too, anonymity is important to my generation. And if I go to a church service, I want to lurk in the background. Right. I don't want to be brought up.
We have a new guest today.
Yeah. Like I do not want to be singled out. I do not want to make a speech. And I'm a heavily extroverted person. But just knowing that about myself and probably many others in my generation, I'm sure there are plenty of exceptions to that, but I think generally speaking, we are profoundly suspicious of any authority at all. Right. And we're just kind of like itching to say to younger or older people, what did you think would happen? Right. Of course they failed. Of course the rocket blew up. Of course, the rock star blew his head off. Like, that's just the way the world is. It's a cold, dark place, man. Yeah. And, in light of all that, I think we have to just create space in our services or online, or and we're somewhat digital natives, depending on not fully like millennials, but like we're young enough that we have some interest in online stuff, and we're able to operate most things, but when we first experienced the internet, Gen X,
right?
The internet was for it was like a free zone where you could be anything you wanted to be, except for yourself. Like, you would never be yourself on the internet. That would just be stupid. So you want to have a handle. I had a high school friend, Vietnamese kid, who used to make fun of my pale Irish skin. He called me white as rice. So that was my name online. I was white as rice, and I just owned it, And that's how people knew me, was by my handle. They didn't know who I was or my age or anything. So we were like the belief that like information should be free, and it should be accessible, and it should be anonymous. And then you millennials came along, and you're just like, no, you should actually use your real name and tell intimate details of your life on the internet. And we were just like, why would you do that? And the internet has really shifted towards that kind of perspective, where it's like more about who being true to who you are, and this whole authenticity, rather than looking in the shot. But that's a long way to say that, if you're going to reach Gen X, I think you have to not be pushy. You have to give them space to belong before they're even willing to hear the message. And if you squeeze them, they're just out, because like they need time to evaluate. They need time to think it through, and they have their own opinions, and they need to be treated gently, rather than just like, hey, you're here, you better repent of your sins. And we're just like we're not gonna go for that.
Yeah, Gen X is not to downplay the importance of Gen X, but they are sort of a transition generation. But so are sort of millennials.
So sad.
But so are millennials in a way.
You're right. We are. I just think that we're usually downplayed more than we should be, because we did do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and I'm not downplaying that, but I guess what I mean by transitional is what you're describing is what just became even more the case with millennials, and even more the case with Gen Z, which is, if I'm going to do this church thing, if I'm going to be a Christian, then I have to be shown why it matters to me, and connect with it on a personal level. Like, it just seems like from the baby boomers on, it's becoming more and more needed to explain why we would do any of this Christian stuff.
Yeah.
And to your point of like, you can't just tell somebody to repent because they're like, well, repent. I don't even know what you're talking about. Like that word doesn't even mean anything. And so the younger we get in terms of generations, the more we're going to have to explain what we're doing and tell them why it matters.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say too that as we age, we do tend to be more willing to try church. And I don't think that's a Gen X thing. I think that's like any generation. You know, people look at churches and they're like, oh, there's just a bunch of old people there. Well, you know, if you look 50 years ago, were there still just a bunch of old people there? Yeah. Okay. So those can't be the same old people.
Right.
So what's going on? You know, like there is something that older people are willing and they're closer to death. You know, like it does kind of make sense. And so I think Gen X, as we're in our middle age years, and then graying and our kids are getting out of the house, we're more open to considering and to expressing our Christianity or entertaining Christianity as a viable option for fulfillment. Yeah. And, so I think there's I already said this before, but I think there is a huge opportunity here to pull in Gen X. And, what we want, I would say is we're not so worried about who we are, like later generations. We never really worried about that.
Right.
We didn't look within to like discover our true selves, like the Frozen movie. That wasn't who, we're more modernists. We're more, prone to respect science and say, well, this is logic. This is science. You can prove this. Right. I will believe it. And so we're looking for that kind of rationality to Christianity, I think, more than other generations that are looking for a more experiential side. And so like old school apologetics work much more on our generation than the younger generations. And I think that's why, it's helpful to like not throw out old things that also worked, in an effort to also reach younger generations. Do it all. Give your reasons for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus, because that speaks to certain people. Exactly. And also talk about authenticity and how if you want to be fulfilled and experience God, then Christ is the way. So I think both these things are important, but we've got to get to the next generation now, because you're a millennial, and even though you're an old soul, you know millennials. What is a millennial? Why are they called millennials?
People who were born between 1981 to 1996, and that's, I've seen different years in the 90s where they cut it off. But the point is this, is, every generation, by the time you become a teenager and adult, you're now in the thick of your generation. And so, when the millennium, the new millennium hit back in the year 2000, and those of us who are old enough remember Y2K and the whole craziness that was around that in late 1999. But I was 16 in the year 2000, so it's sort of perfect. Like the new millennium, the turn of the millennium was when I was the middle of my teens, and so that I am sort of like right in the sweet spot for millennials. And unlike how baby boomers raised Gen X, and we talked about the different, there's an older wave of baby boomers and a younger wave of baby boomers. The older wave raised Gen X, right? But then younger baby boomers raised millennials. Right. And that's, so, and to a degree, again, because my situation is a little different because I'm the youngest of five by 12 years. And so I have older siblings who are Gen X, and my parents sort of treated me like Gen X. However, people who are my age and younger were parented in such a way where they were given all of these kinds of opportunities. And it started with Gen X, but this was the generation that really had their parents give them everything that they needed or wanted. I want to be a part of this after school program. Okay, we'll drive you there. Make you a part of that. I want to follow this interest. Okay, we'll encourage you to do that. That's really what defines millennials, is that we basically got everything we wanted. And what that means is we think we're really special. As Hayden Shaw says in his book, millennials think differently because they were raised differently. So we think we're special because we were raised to believe that we were special. And that, you know, there's a truth to that, but at the same time, a little bit, you can have too much of that as well.
And so you guys are second half of your 20s and all in your 30s.
Right.
Maybe like a couple of you in your early 40s. So,
Right.
but mostly you're in your 30s or late 20s. What I also saw about your generation was that was just so pivotal was that 2008 financial crisis.
Right.
Because I saw so many young people that I had already been ministering to for, you know, in my position as a pastor, where they went to college and they did things right. You know,
Right.
they didn't get into like hippie land. They didn't get into drugs. They actually got through, they got decent grades, and the job wasn't there.
Right.
And 2008 just like wiped out so many millennials. And then they had to get some lower paying job that they were overqualified for. And
Right.
for many of them, that they've never recovered from that. Because like where you start really does matter as far as like how things progress in your career.
Yeah. And not to mention the you know, tens of thousands, if not more, spent on that education, and then not having a job to pay that back. So you're
Right.
burdened with all
College
this
debt is huge for millennials.
right? You're burdened with all of this debt. You don't have a great job. You know, I don't know to what degree it affected us here in Canada, the 2008 recession, but it certainly, from an outsider's perspective, looking at what happened in the States, you know, that's what sort of led to the rise of Obama and his you know, call for change and that sort of thing. And a lot of people liked that message and wanted to be a part of it. I happen to think that Democratic policies are not going to help the economy. So that's kind of, you know, why that didn't actually pan out. But that's why he was popular, I think, part of it at least.
Well, he can't, his inaugural speech was "Yes, we can,"
Right.
and I think a lot of people, maybe not just millennials, but we're very inspired to hear a president talk in such a positive way.
Right.
And you know, we were mired in this war for terror for
Right.
so long, war against terrorism, and
Right.
you know the slogan "Making the world safe for democracy." Meanwhile, like creating
Yeah.
a lot of problems that generated a lot of terrorists. You had the Guantanamo Bay
Yeah.
interrogations, the torture. Obama comes in and he's just like, you know, we're going to do better.
Yeah.
You know, he actually called out terrorists in his inauguration speech. And he's like, you know, you guys need to knock it off, you know. And, you know, there was just sort of like I don't know, optimism that
Right.
came with Obama that, and millennials really were incredibly engaged
Yeah.
in politics at a young age,
Right.
much younger than I think a lot of other, more like the boomers, you know, where
Yeah.
they were at a young age engaged. Whereas like Gen X, like we all know it's a sham anyhow. So what do we care?
The thing is, millennials had their JFK moment, as we mentioned in the last episode. 9/11 happened when I was a teenager, right? So I was in. I remember that day. Like I remember where I was. I was at high school, and you know, got to lunch, and people were telling me about what had happened in the morning, and I'm like, that was as a sheltered kid growing up in Southern Ontario. You know, I didn't even really know what the World Trade Centers were. I'd seen them before, but I don't know what they are, and so that event opened my eyes to the greater world, you know, and that was really what started my political journey, if you will. So to your point of, you know, 9/11 happens, were attacked at home in a grand spectacle way, horrible way, those buildings falling down. And 9/11 changed so many people's lives, both the people who were literally affected, but then those of us who were just seeing it and realizing what kind of world we're a part of. And then instead of being, let's say, inspired in a good way, the U.S. goes to war, and the Department of Homeland Security is created, and now when you go to the airport, you have to be checked, in various ways, invasive ways, right?
Yeah, so that was such a big change.
Yeah, and so this is sort of one of the main points I said about millennials in the series, is that millennials are unique because we remember what life was like before the internet and before the war on terror, and when we were young kids. However, we then got to experience and in fact have been influenced by how things have changed, both in terms of the political scene, but also just how technology has changed all of our lives. We adapted to it very easily because we grew up with it in a way. So that's very important to understand about millennials is how we are special in that way. If I can speak for my own generation, we are special because we I think have a respect for previous generations that maybe Gen Xers didn't have or baby boomers didn't have. I think we respect older generations, although I guess everybody is able to say okay boomer no matter what age you are. And that certainly does happen. But the way technology changed our lives and the way the political landscape changed our lives as well. And then to your point, the recession.
Yeah, I would say you guys you really witnessed the transition to the internet.
Yeah,
that's
right.
And I don't think you were like players in the early days. Like I remember life before the internet. When the modem first came out, and there was what existed before the internet were called bulletin boards.
Right.
And I remember being a kid and hooking up to a bulletin board and a BBS, as we called them, and you could see files on there and you could download them, but it was just like a local, little system. It wasn't connected to all the other computers in the world.
Right.
And it was, however many computers connected to it was how many it had. And then when the internet came about, I remember that. I remember just learning HTML, learning what a website is. Like I've had dozens of websites in my life. And, millennials, by the time they came along, it was like, I think, the older ones know what I'm talking about, but a lot of the younger ones are like, yeah, the internet is just a thing. It exists. I know what it is. I know what it does, but they didn't see its early days. They just take it for granted. And so I think there's some transition that happens in your generation as far as that goes.
We got for me at least, we were never a family that bought computers in the early 90s and that sort of thing. So we didn't really get a computer until the late 90s, and the internet was an established thing by then.
Yeah.
And it was just, there it all is. And to my point, I think I personally and many of us easily adapted to the internet to the point where it became just a part of our lives. We got to see the transition at least because the internet age continued to grow, obviously throughout the years that I experienced, going from messenger apps, right? Like we would ICQ or chat, I forget, IRC chat or whatever it was, and then MSN Messenger, and that's how my wife and I got to know each other. She was living in a different city and going to school, and we would chat on MSN Messenger, and kids today are like, what even is that? Yeah. Right? Because this was before texting and social media as we knew it, right? As we know it now.
So you were the first generation to have online dating.
Yeah, exactly.
And email be part of the relationship equation.
That's how it started. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because like, you see each other at church, but you connect through email and messaging each
Yeah.
other. So that's how we got together.
Cool. Now,
Yeah.
what about Christianity? How does Christianity appeal to millennials?
Well, millennials, again, because we're unique insofar as we have a connection to the older generations. And again, I might be just being projecting my own situation, but so I can identify with church as it's always been done, and to what you were saying, like the sort of a rational approach and try to here's the best argument now, accept it. I can That appealed to me, and that's why I became all these different things like the biblical Unitarian and so on, because arguments from people like you were presented, and I was like, that makes sense, that I'll change
Yeah.
my mind. But something happened with my generation, and certainly with the Gen Z, is that doesn't appeal to them. And so we're seeing the beginnings of what is called the post-Christian era, of the assumptions that many of us have and had as when we were younger in terms of Christian assumptions just aren't the case for a lot of young people. And so if you're going to appeal to younger millennials, then you need to start, again, as I was saying, explaining to them why we would even bother with any of this stuff, and how we can contribute to the community, and how we can enable them to use their gifts and their talents for good. I think that's more so what is happening in the church as it relates to younger millennials and going into Gen Z, is that church is becoming a combination of appealing to Gen Xers and older in the traditional ways that we've done that over the past few decades, but also a real shift in thinking in terms of appealing to young people. Just trying to prove to them about God isn't going to be enough. They have to understand why that matters and why being a Christian matters. So, started with the millennials.
So, what would you say would be a strategy to appeal to them as far as like an ethos or a culture to develop within the church?
Yeah, yeah, and this is to be totally fair, I think Gen Z in particular, which we'll get into in a second, I guess, are young enough and not quite old enough to really have something we can zero in on. But certainly younger millennials is sort of what I was saying of allow them to express themselves and to
Okay.
contribute, to feel like that they're part of the process, that they know why we're doing what we're doing, and that we're not just doing it because that's what we've always done.
So would that be empowering them?
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
like
Giving them a
taking
seat at the table.
that's exactly it. Taking a, let's say, a 30, well, it's very much how I was affirmed as a 30-year-old man back in 2014. I was affirmed by this church to say, hey, you're 30 years old. You love God. You love the scripture. You have a talent for this. You don't have any experience as a pastor, but we're going to give you this opportunity to grow into that role. And that appealed for various reasons why I accepted this role as pastor of this church. But it really met that need of affirmation, right? And that's what young millennials are looking for, to be affirmed for who they are, what their value is as people.
Yeah. Yeah. Trying to think of like maybe a saying of Jesus or something from the Bible that would uniquely stick out to the millennial mindset. Maybe um, is authenticity a big part of your generation?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So like Jesus, he preaches a lot against hypocrisy
right.
and the Pharisees, and some of
Yeah,
the things he says in Matthew 23, he just blows them out of the water.
right.
And like you look at Jesus, you look at the disciples, and I think older generations, especially mine, want to reduce it to a systematic theology. We want to list out, here are the 72 things that we can infer Jesus, or no, forget infer. We can deduce that
Yeah,
Jesus believed. and we
Right.
can write them down on a piece of paper, and that'll be clear. And
Yeah.
then we'll really grasp it. Whereas I think a millennial is more like, all right, I want to, like Rob Bell back in the day before he
Right.
got super universalist and kind of like lost influence in Christianity. Back in the day, his church was blowing up because he
Right.
was doing all this really interesting stuff on like Hebrew roots
Right.
and looking at, well, what does it mean to actually follow Jesus as a
Right.
lifestyle? And that I think appealed a lot in the later 90s, early 2000s, where people are like, you know what, propositional truth is not that exciting. I want to live as a follower of Jesus. I want to live as a disciple of Christ. And that sort of maybe like experiential side um, was a little more appealing to the millennials.
Yeah. The one of the unique things about millennials, although I mean there certainly have been people in previous generations, but millennials don't feel the need to have to go to church. They're like you could even find older millennials or Gen Xers who don't go to church, but if you say, hey, you should probably go to church, and they would probably say, yeah, I know I don't go, but I probably should. Whereas younger millennials and people younger than that, if they weren't raised in it and they don't see the value of it, then what is the point?
Yeah.
They're not going to stand for anything phony. So if they went to a church and they weren't spoken to in a way that highlighted why it's important that we believe what we believe and do what we do, they would just not go to that church any longer, right? They don't feel the need like they have to do this.
Yeah, there's no loyalty there. It's more like, is this meeting my needs? Is there a good reason for it?
Yeah.
Practicality is important,
Right.
and yeah, basically being recognized as having value. What you said before, I think that is definitely a huge thing. Jesus called all these young guys to follow him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he
Exactly.
said, look, I'm a rabbi. I want you to be my disciple. And they're just like, me?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they're like, he's like, yeah, and he believed in them. And then he sent them out,
Right.
and, he gave people responsibility.
Right. Yeah. That's very
So
important.
there's an example there.
Yeah.
What about Generation Z?
Yeah, so Generation Z, and the reason why they're called that is because, we had Generation X, because there wasn't a great, sort of unifying term for them. So they're just Generation X, whatever. And people were thinking, maybe we'll call the next generation Generation Y, and that'll stand for Y2K for the year 2000. Well, millennials is the term that stuck more than Generation Y, but when it came to name this last generation, they just, X, Y, Z. Okay, Generation Z, for all Canadian sticklers, Generation Z, but I prefer Z. Yeah,
Still
but
speaking the Queen's English over there, huh?
exactly. So they are those who are born between 1997 and approximately 2014, something like that. They became adults in the late last decade of the 2010s, are becoming adults now, and will do so throughout the rest of the decade. So they're young teenagers all the way to young adults, something like that at the moment. And in their very short lives, they've gone through a lot. They perhaps can remember the 2000s with the war on terror and
Probably not. They're probably just kids,
yeah.
right?
Oh, for sure. And I don't mean it had a like a conscious effect on them. But when you're watching TV in the background or hearing news or whatever, it can inform who you are in a sense.
Okay,
So
I see what you're
that
saying.
yeah, but more so in the 2010s when you mentioned we even my generation didn't do nuclear bomb drills, but there was the fear of mass shootings. I was in high school when the Columbine shootings happened, and nowadays with Gen Z, especially a few years ago, it seemed like every couple weeks there was a new mass shooting that was happening. So that that's a big part of who they are, is that fear. But they're also a culture. Who they are people of acceptance. So, and the main people that are in need of acceptance, from their point of view, is LGBT people, and or people who are minorities, like the Black Lives Matter movement, or people who have been wronged, like the Me Too movement. They're looking for justice, and I think that's great. But I just wonder. I have a lot to say, not a lot to say, but I have something I really want to say about Gen Z, but I also don't want to break the flow of our conversation. So what do you think we should talk about?
Let me just come back on that a little bit. I would say that these are really more millennial shifts, because Gen Z, they're young enough that they're not really having much influence on the culture.
That's right.
But these events, and not just millennial, but also Gen X, we're actually the ones driving this. We're the ones that are exposing the sexual harassment in the workplace. Like, what generation is Matt Lauer? What generation is Epstein?
Right. Right.
It's not Gen Z or even millennial, probably.
Right.
Right. So the whole society, but it doesn't matter. Your point is sustained. The whole society has decided that. Not just acceptance, but approval of any minority viewpoint or lifestyle or proclivity is itself a virtue. And
exactly.
And previous generations did not talk or think that way. There was a lot more freedom. So the new desire is very dogmatic, very intolerant. And I'm not saying about Gen Z. I'm saying in our world today, the world that Gen Z is growing up in. Whereas like boomers are like, hey, let's burn it all to the ground and build something better. And Gen X is just like, we don't think it's better. Let's burn that to the ground too. Yeah. And then, where we're at now is like, no, there is something better. It's total acceptance. And if you dare to even say that there's not systemic racism today, you're evil. Like a Gen Xer wouldn't call somebody else evil. We would say we disagree with you. But like the moral, arrogance that we see in our world today among, these older generations, that's what these Gen Zers are growing up with. And they're just like very much respecting authority, but only certain authorities that conform with their like very rigid, very moral sense of what is right and wrong.
If I may make an overall comment about this and get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure.
And for everyone listening, like I'm not qualified to make what I'm about to say be definitive or dogmatic about this, but I tend to think that the more, and I've thought about this a lot, the more Gen Z in particular is growing up in this world that Sean's describing, the more they grow up in that, and the less influenced they are by Christianity, and even forget about institutional Christianity, genuine Christianity. The less that they are influenced by Christianity, the more they're going to take on these things in a religious sort of way.
Yes.
Because they don't have Christianity to fill that void within them, or that that everything, that sense of structure and balance that religion gives us, Christianity in particular gives us. They're not going to have it, so they have to find it somewhere, and they're finding it in identity politics. It doesn't matter whether individually you've done anything right or wrong. It matters what group you're a part of.
Right.
Right.
And for two of us as white guys, that are straight and Christian, like, we're checking all the wrong boxes before we even get to say a word or do a thing. And we are guilty just because of our whiteness, or we're guilty just because of our straightness, or we're guilty just because we agree with the biggest religion in the world.
Right.
Like any majority position on anything is immediately suspect, and that is new. That has not been
Yep.
that way historically. And yet I think Jesus can still appeal to people who are growing up
Yeah.
in this world. And,
Yeah.
Part of it is like, well, Jesus was a victim of
Right. Right.
injustice. Okay, so that's attractive. Like Jesus stood up for the sexually immoral people in his world and called them back to community. He also called them to repentance.
Right.
But he would bring the outcast back in, and so there's a lot of what Jesus did and what the gospel brings, as far as like Jesus dying for our sins, and Jesus was a pretty rigid moralist as well. They can
Right.
relate to that. Jesus is an expert. He's a guru. And if you're looking for an authority to trust to help you to figure out what's right and wrong, well, Jesus is a great option for that. I think he
Right.
is the way, the truth, the life. But we won't read that verse to the Gen Z people up front. They need to taste and see that the Lord
Right.
is good before they're willing to, in any sense, jump on board. But I think there's still a lot within Christianity. And the other thing too is like you mentioned how like, all right, boomers like tore down like the 500-year-old like organ hymnal approach. And then Gen Xers, we brought in like the 4-piece band, with the guitar, the bass, the drums. Is it a 3-piece band? I don't know. Am I missing something? Yeah, keyboard. Yeah, so we have the keyboard here too. So, now like Gen Z, it's all about the experience.
Right.
Like if they go to a church, it's to experience God. It's not to learn doctrine or to learn how to live a certain way.
Yeah.
And so like that whole postmodern like mindset that says my personal experience is more important than what principles might say based on rational thinking or science, or none of that matters. What matters is my personal experience. So like if a Gen Z person has an experience with God where like God touches them and they like experience forgiveness, or they experience purpose, or they realize a kind of confidence in a way of life, where Jesus is giving them the morals that they're so desperately seeking, that I think could be very effective as a strategy to reach these people today. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that we are trying to appeal to them because to my point earlier of if they're embracing, for lack of a better term, left-wing ideology, if they're embracing that identity politics ideology, and they're doing so in a religious way, well, you just described 4 or 5, 6, 7 things that Jesus can fulfill in them, that same desire that they have, but fulfill it in a much deeper way, in a much more real way. So I think you certainly can appeal to them on their own level. But I think the other thing that I've realized is being people who are believing in objective moral truth, things that rationality matters, and that there actually is such a thing as truth, and so on. That's now counterculture. So like I don't know. There's almost a certain degree of, if we're living in a post-Christian world, well, then suddenly we're now back to how Christianity was originally, which was, it was not the accepted norm. It was the counterculture fighting against the machine, so to speak. So I don't know. I think we should own that. Like, I think we should, in a sense, say, hey, we have the real thing here, and what you're looking for and what you're trying to fill, what you're missing inside is actually going to end in nothing good for society. That's for sure. Or for themselves as individuals.
Yeah.
And so we need to show them that we have something real, and it both appeals to them and also challenges them at the same time.
Yeah. I've been impressed by how profoundly moralistic they are. Did you ever see that book, The Coddling of the American Mind?
No.
it talks about how when Gen Z first went to college, the college campuses had all these problems, and like their anxiety, their
Right.
depression, their penchant for therapy, were like all those were way higher than they had been for previous students, and
Right.
that these Gen Z kids came along and they were just livid if the college, if the administration tolerated a position that they disagreed with or that they perceived as hurtful emotionally to a minority. And so they'd have all these just really violent and vile reactions to positions they disagreed with.
Right.
And I would say that they are fundamentalists. They are not liberal.
Exactly.
You know, you say they're left. You know, the old definition of left is liberal. Liberal is just another word for freedom. That's not, I don't think, characteristic of this generation. They are dogmatic. You have to accept and approve of everyone's narrative, but only if they are in some way a victim or a minority or on the bottom side of power. As soon as you get into a powerful position, you know, now you're, you know, in a different category. So I was thinking about what drives that. What is the felt need that is pushing this? And I think it really comes down to compassion. You know, there is just an incredible emphasis in Gen Z of compassion towards somebody that's struggling with their gender. And, you know, they're in a biological male body and they cognitively believe they're female. And that's causing them acute mental anguish and distress. And the Gen Z person looks at that and says, oh my goodness, you poor thing. Let me come alongside you. Whereas like some of us older generations are like, look, man, you're obviously struggling with a mental problem here. Let's find a solution for you in therapy or psychosomatic drug or, you know, psychotropic drugs or something like that. Whereas like Gen Z is like, no. The problem is society. Society needs to accept this person and then their pain will go away. And, you know, even if I disagree with that, I can still appreciate where it's coming from, which is this desire to show love and kindness and compassion to people. And I think Christianity, like we have a corner on the market on love. Like we are the love religion. Like our founder said the most important thing was to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said to love your enemies. I mean, that's going a level deeper than Gen Z has ever even, you know, really considered. You know, because they're just loving those who are like them. But like Jesus can bring them even deeper than that. I'm totally stereotyping. No. I'm sorry to all Gen Zs listening to this. But, you know, I just think there's so much in our faith that, you know, serves as hooks to non-Christians in this generation.
I think you're totally right that they have this abundance of compassion, but that's one of the more frustrating things about them, which frustrates me, which is I'm somebody who really wants to help people, you know, or just let's say Christianity in general. We want to help people. We want to see people have mental health and see justice in the world and so on. And yet the people who are very locked into that, their worldview and their understanding of who needs compassion and who doesn't, you know, why aren't we given compassion and understanding to say, we're not trying to be bigoted, we're not trying to be hateful, we're just simply trying to give you a different perspective on what we think the solution to some of the problems that we're facing in the world today.
Yeah, and I think that's what Gen Z needs to see. Gen Z needs to see the church say, look, you know, to the trans person, look, we can't agree with your definition of gender, but we care about you. We want to help you, and we want to walk this path alongside you. And you know, Gen Z is only hearing the first sentence. We can't agree with your definition of gender. They're only hearing that, and so I think as a church, we need to, you know, be careful to also say the second half of that. But we love you. Jesus died for you. God wants a relationship with you. and you're welcome to come to our church. You're welcome to come and address to our
Yeah.
church, even though you're a guy, and sit in the back and just listen and see what sinks in. You know, a lot of churches, if they had a bearded person in a dress,
Yeah.
you know, that would be a deal breaker. They'd be like, oh,
Yeah.
look at this, you know. But like, who did Jesus spend time with, Dan?
Yeah.
Who did he spend time with? The weirdos, the outcasts, the ones that were not living the stereotypical Jewish, you know. How many Pharisees? These were like the superstars who were, you know, the real successful ones in their culture. How many Pharisees followed Jesus? Only a few.
Right. Yeah.
How many prostitutes followed Jesus? How many tax collectors followed Jesus? How many women followed Jesus? You know, lots. So I think there's a real opportunity here.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the church, or the churches that will survive and you know, reach out to young people and embrace young people, are going to be the churches that both hold on to truth, but also are not afraid of external things that ultimately we can tolerate. That, see, I see, this is the weird thing. I think the tolerance does not mean giving up on truth.
Right.
Tolerance should mean you allow people to agree to disagree and follow, you know, get to truth in their own time, in their own way, you know, and you're there to help them. You're there to encourage them. That's what we're trying to do at our church, and we're not seeing the results yet. But then again, it could be that Gen Z is still, to the point we made earlier, they're still growing up, and so they may not have. You said the older you get, the more you see the need for church. I think eventually Gen Z people are going to want to go to church and be a part of church, and we need to be ready for that.
Yeah.
And be accepting of where they're at in their life.
Yeah, I would agree too. Just kind of wrapping things up here, because we are running late on time. But I do agree that Gen Z sees the least reason to physically be present.
Right. That's right.
And this is kind of problematic for a lot of us who are not like superstar celebrities on TV and, you know, with millions of followers on our app or whatever. They have access to those superstar preachers.
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, then they're going to come to like one of, you know, the local church website, and they're going to be like, wow, this website doesn't even work that well on my phone. And, you know, the spacing is off and the fonts aren't trendy, you know, to my liking. Dark mode doesn't even work. I'm like getting blinded by this thing, you know, and, you know, then they're going to go to like, you know, one of these big shot apps on their phone, and they're like, oh, it's so smooth, and this preacher's so slick, and he dresses so cool, and his hair is coiffed in just the right way. And, you know, he's like the YouTubers I watch. He's got influence, you know, and that's their world, you know? So, I think we are going to see that trend continuing in that direction, for better or for worse. But, you know, I think the experience side of it, once again, is something that the local church can afford Gen Z, that you can't get it on an app, and you can't even get it in the metaverse with, you know, goggles strapped to your head, because just, you know, maybe you will, you know, in 10 years, but like just the way the technology is right now, it's just not there to, you know, there's that feeling you get when everyone in the room is singing, and there's like, you know, you feel like you're breaking through and you're touching God, or he's reaching down and touching you. And, you know, it's different when I hear a person 3 rows over from me chuckle during the sermon than if I'm sitting by myself. And I think it's like somewhat funny, but I, you know, the experience of being there is still unbeatable.
Yeah. And that's why I think a lot of, you know, church growth experts, or whatever you want to call them, are saying that the path forward, especially post-pandemic, is a hybrid model of in-person and online. Because if you're going to reach people, it's probably going to be online. But what is the thing that we can, to your point, what is the thing that we can offer, you know, that you can't get online? A real sense of community, a real sense of making a difference. And that's why. And it's in some ways discouraging to somebody like me and you who love Bible study and truth and trying to unpack the truth. That might not appeal to them. But we can't give up on that either, because first of all, there are older people, but also we engage in the things that will resonate with young people,
Yeah.
and then
Well,
hopefully
take them to the soup kitchen.
yeah, exactly.
Take them to sort clothes that are going to be that have been donated to battered women and
Yeah.
suffering domestic violence. Take them to an animal justice type
Right.
shelter where people are trying to help animals get adopted, or pets and so on. These are all aspects of our faith that like from a muscle point of view have atrophied in the body of Christ.
Yeah.
And Gen Z's here to say, hey, I'm reading this Matthew 25 of my Bible about the sheep and the goats, and
Yeah.
the things that Jesus is saying are so important. I don't really see you old timers doing.
Yeah.
That's a critique. And we need to
Yeah.
be able to hear that. And just like we need to listen to other generations too. And we need to be able to empower them to all right, so you're passionate about refugees. Like we have a refugee center in downtown Albany here. All right, so let's do something. Let's go.
Right.
And let's help refugees learn how to navigate the healthcare system in America, which is so complicated. Let me tell you.
Right.
Let's help them when they first get to the country, learn how to navigate a grocery store and these basic skills that refugees are going to need. Or like if we start getting Ukrainian refugees,
Right.
that might be something that Gen Z would be very passionate about. So I think it's just different.
Yep.
It's not. I don't want to say Gen X is better than Millennials, who are better than Gen Z, who are better than Gen Alpha, which we didn't really talk about.
I don't want to. Yeah.
You know,
I'll tell you why. Well, leave my babies alone. Let them stay babies.
I've got 3 kids in that Gen Z,
Yeah.
and then my 4th kid is
Right.
Alpha. So yeah, I mean,
You're gonna get.
we don't even know what's going on there.
Exactly. We don't know
But it'll
what
be
to expect.
exciting, And I think the gospel speaks to every generation. And I think
100%.
God's dream of a healed, renewed world in the kingdom age, the kingdom of God, that's a message that's just always going to resonate. Resurrection is
Yep.
always going to be popular because we have this problem called death,
That's right.
and we
That's
may
right.
look at it differently, but it's still a problem, especially when somebody you love dies or when you come to die yourself. Resurrection is really, and we're about to celebrate that as we come up to Resurrection Sunday next month.
Right.
But it is always going to be big. So and Christianity is not shrinking. It's not dying. It's not going anywhere. The demographers say we're going to keep pace with the population over the next 20, 30 years. And, by 2050, we're going to be just as from a percentage point of view, just as big as we are now. Just not in the same places.
Right. That's right.
You know what I mean? Like it is shrinking in America. That is true. But it's growing like crazy in Africa and Asia. And so,
Yeah.
I don't want to be an alarmist and say, oh my goodness, Gen Z just likes to use apps. Well, so what? Maybe that's better. Maybe we need to listen to that.
Yeah.
Maybe
The
we
gospel.
need to invest in that, instead of investing so much in other things that maybe aren't even doing any good.
Exactly. The gospel message will always speak to people because it speaks to some of the deepest fears and deepest need and desires that we have. And that's why God uses it and powerfully uses it. And I think the reason why it's, Christianity might be growing in certain other countries, maybe poorer countries, is because they don't have as many things in the way. They can embrace that message because they don't we live in a society where we're so distracted and our time is filled with so many different things.
Yeah.
And we don't stop and think about our mortality. We don't stop and think about, is there more than life than this, and why do we exist, and so on. And so maybe it's just a matter of reaching out to young people in such a way where they can identify with what we're saying, and but then we give them, instead of whatever else they would fill their time and hearts with, we give them Jesus and the gospel instead.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, Daniel. Well, thanks so much for this stimulating conversation. It really is an important subject that we're talking about today. And, as Great Commission people, Jesus had given us a Great Commission to make disciples of all nations. Well, hey, that includes Canada. That includes the United States of America. That includes Australia. That includes the UK and these other, I'm focusing on English-speaking places where we are struggling with these these critiques against Christian values. And so, the question is not like, well, they're wrong, so they're just not going to become Christian. I don't think that's a healthy attitude. I think the attitude is like, all right, well, what does appeal? What can we say? And we don't want to compromise truth. We don't want to compromise Jesus and just be like, yeah, he's just one option among many. We don't really believe that. So that's not really an option for us.
Yeah.
But how do we present Jesus to people today, and in a way that's compelling? And I think, considering the different generations and their different life experiences and how they approach truth and the big questions and the good life. What is a good life?
Right.
It really does explain how we can be faithful to our Lord and make disciples of all nations. So I just want to thank you for bringing this topic to my radar and for spending this time with me.
My pleasure, Sean, anytime. And I think, again, people we can all benefit from learning from our past, but also looking ahead to the generations that are growing up now and understanding what they're in need of.